Thank you, Monica. Thank you to everyone who joined us in that excellent last panel into Our Daily Planet. We are thrilled to have former Democratic presidential candidate, Mayor of South Bend, and New Deal leader, Pete Buttigieg, with us for the next half hour. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. Today, our audience, not surprisingly, is an organization based in Washington, D.C., is significantly from within the Beltway, and if it's not, it's mostly on the West Coast or in New York. Especially since the pandemic, we haven't had a chance to travel or be in or part of red or swing states in America. And as a candidate, as the former mayor of South Bend, and as an Indianan, you have and live there. So I want to start with that. We have 125,000 dead, more than 1 million infected with COVID-19, the worst infection rate in the world, 21 million unemployed, and the list of challenges this country faces right now: racial justice protests, climate denial, and then the emerging news of potentially Russian bounties on the heads of American soldiers. And that's just the last 6 months. Yet,
Right.
From the perspective of all of us, we look at the polls, which obviously are not always predictable or reliable, but Donald Trump is only 10 points down nationally and is competitive or tied in Florida, North Carolina, Arizona. He's leading in Indiana. And I think for those of us who don't live with supporters of Donald Trump or people who aren't committed to one party or another, the question is, how is this race still so close, and why do people still stick with the president under these circumstances?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. And, New Deal was one of the most important efforts that I participated in as mayor and to each of the co-sponsors here. I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because the view from on the ground here in Indiana is a little bit different than the headquarters of a lot of our party and advocacy organizations, and for that matter, a lot of our media organizations too. And it's worth remembering that in our system, people get sorted into one of two camps, even if they don't fully identify with either of them. And there's a lot of that goes on around here and in lots of parts of the country. I will say this, though. If you'd asked me 3 or 4 months ago whether anyone in the base behind this president could be shaken out of it, I would have thought, if you've stuck along for all of this, if you stayed with him through Gold Star Families and John McCain and Access Hollywood and Helsinki and Charlottesville, nothing could possibly come along that would that would motivate you to say this far but no further. I was wrong. There is evidence that people, not everybody, but a non-trivial number of people are ready to step away. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, it's glaring how inadequate this administration's response has been to meet the moment, and there's just no getting around it. And right now, if you look beneath the top layer of the numbers, we're seeing that the pandemic is expanding largely in more conservative states. And healthcare and public health is an example of one of those issues that, in the end, it's hard to fool people about what's happening in their own lives. To me, one of the most remarkable things to happen all year is that last night we got the results from Oklahoma, that by a ballot initiative, people in Oklahoma voted to amend their constitution so that even their own governor couldn't stop the expansion of Medicaid. And this is an example of the gap, I think, between voters in conservative areas, or even conservative voters, and a lot of politicians on the far right now. Now, what we've got to do is make sure we cultivate and build on this moment, because there are, just as a matter of basic human psychology, ways to invite people over to your side, and there are ways to push them right back to where they were. And we have an opportunity right now to ask people to think about what a future could look like that's just different from how we got here. And in this moment, it's about a lot more than just pointing out to how dreadful the Trump administration has been, although that's very real. It's inviting people to picture what a better future might look like, where we have better healthcare, where we have real infrastructure, where we have addressed the most glaring issues of racial and economic inequality in this country. And there is a big American majority for that across people who have habitually voted one way or the other. And that's one of the reasons why, for all the bleakness of our moment in some ways, I think this is also a time for a lot of optimism in others.
Thanks. And I think your last point is so important, both in terms of providing optimism to people, but also the opportunity. And, an example of that, even in just the last two panels that we hosted prior to your joining us, and across all of the events we've done in the last 3 months, environmental justice, exposure of racial inequalities in climate, safe water, and public health issues due to COVID-19 have finally broken through. They too often in the past were shunted aside or ignored, and um, the conversation's being had. But what's some examples of what policymakers can really do to address these issues? And is that is that a key to addressing voters of color, particularly younger voters, who are skeptical about whether their vote makes a difference?
Yeah, I think one of the messages for younger voters is the longer you're planning to be here, the more you have at stake in a bunch of decisions that are about to be made that can't be reversed that'll affect the rest of your life. And nowhere is that clearer than around environmental issues. And I think sometimes environmental issues were considered kind of an elite concern in the past. But as we've seen through concerns like the poisoning of children, mainly Black children in Flint because of lead in drinking water, as we've seen issues around the outsized impact that climate-related extreme weather has had on communities of color and low-income communities. And we've seen that right here in South Bend. Both of those issues actually right here in South Bend. What we're seeing is that environmental justice and racial justice are intimately connected. There's also a question of justice between generations, generational justice, because when you have figures in Washington saying we don't want to take any of the steps needed to secure the future, what they're really saying is that we would rather punish a future generation for our own inability to solve these problems. So we've got to get out of a false choice that sets up a trade-off between doing the right thing for the economy and doing the right thing for the environment, much as we had to defeat the false choice and still do between the idea that either we surrender to the virus or we're destroying our economy. When actually, as Austin Goolsbee put it, the first rule of virus economics is you got to fix the virus in order to have better economics. It's the same thing with climate. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for a younger generation to lead the way, as they really have when it comes to climate, when it comes to racial justice, when it comes to gun safety, and demonstrate that there is already an American majority, even though these ideas can't seem to command a majority in today's Washington. And that's where, first of all, we've got to be much more serious, I think, about democratic reform, structural reform, to the conditions that keep a majority of the American people from being reflected in policy, knowing that there are concrete policies right now that we know would make a difference around carbon pricing, around greater funding for renewable energy research, energy distribution, storage, and capture of carbon. But also recognize that these changes really are going to be very swift in terms of our public opinion. Matter of fact, they're already there. One of my favorite metaphors furnished by American culture is that of a coyote chasing Roadrunner, running off the cliff, but hasn't looked down yet. I think that's where we are in terms of a lot of these kind of old habits and resistance to ideas, that the moment is past, they're off the cliff, they just haven't looked down yet.
On that note in particular, one of the things I found interesting in the response in the media and from Republicans with the unveiling of the House Select Committee climate report, and then the introduction and hopefully passage this week of the major transportation bill that the House considered, is the perception that from the media that the plans are unrealistic, that they may be too ambitious. And the Washington Post even yesterday noted that there's concern that the plans will quote unquote hurt Democrats in the fall. Republicans are, they're already criticizing it, as we all knew they would, as the Green New Deal too. How, to your point about the Roadrunner and Coyote, is this just sort of another lagging indicator where the perception is just incorrect and these attacks can't work? And do we need to do anything else to make it clear that ambitious climate policy isn't a political liability?
Well, I think a lot depends on how we talk about it. These are policies whose time has come that can command the support of the American majority and that are needed. But we need to make sure that we talk about them in a way that isn't dismissive of the very real fears that some people have who can't see where they fit in a greener future. Now, the reality is, as I look around, certainly South Bend, I'm thinking about, I think when people picture green jobs, they imagine you have to be a specialist in photovoltaic cells. We're going to need union carpenters and electrical workers to help do building retrofits that we need so that we have more energy efficiency and less carbon emissions. We're going to need the very same manufacturing base that has built petroleum-based, fossil fuel-based autos across the last 100 years, especially in my part of the country, to be there building a next generation of cleaner transportation as well as cleaner fuel sources. We got to make sure we're not dismissive when we talk about those who do wonder if they're going to be left behind. And they don't have to be. In fact, that's part of what good policy does. It finds ways to train and equip and harness those who have always contributed to our economy but need to do it on new terms. And yeah, I remember moment after moment on my presidential campaign, Shenandoah, Western Iowa, very conservative, rural area. We were in a barn. It was packed. It was hot. And there was someone maybe 20, kind of looked like a prototypical farm kid raising his hand saying, how is my community and my generation of people involved in agriculture can be part of the solution on climate? And there's a very real answer to that. Actually, we need agriculture to help lead the way. Some of the possibilities around soil management, for example, really change what our carbon capture future might look like. The original carbon capture technology is, plants. And we've got to make sure we weave that full picture. And sometimes because of where I think a lot of our most influential and dynamic thinkers and talkers on some of these policy issues sit, they don't always instinctively fold that rural perspective into the story we're telling, but we can and we should, because it's also rural America that stands among those with the most to lose if we fail to meet the moment when it comes to climate.
And one question around there that you hit on the word green, and that a lot of the people that will benefit, whether it's in agriculture or particularly the traditional manufacturing and industrial unions, don't necessarily see themselves as part of the transition to the green economy. How much of it is actually just a narrative and wording problem that, as others have said, green jobs and clean energy jobs now have just become jobs? And
Yes.
is there a different way we should be talking about it, particularly those of us in the climate and energy advocacy community?
I think a lot of it's making sure that we demonstrate the blue collar potential of the jobs that are going to be added. It's not just kind of trying to make up for jobs that may phase out. It's celebrating the additional jobs, millions we estimated in the climate plan we put together, and that's very much harmonized with what's coming out of the House right now. So yes, and a lot of it's just making sure that folks are included in the conversation too, and they have a vocabulary already with them. That when we fuse it up to these policy priorities can make a huge difference. Look, this is a do or die moment. I mean, up until now, I think these things have been talked about as abstract and theoretical and far off. But you look at the ticking clock that's set not by Congress, but by science. And we basically have a decade to make these dramatic changes. The question of whether we can pull it off in time or not, whether it's too ambitious or not, is ultimately a question that I think misses the fact that we just plain have to. And I think also there's an opportunity to harness a kind of progressive patriotism around this. A country like ours should not be daunted by the challenge in front of us. We should be excited about it. We should be motivated by it. And I actually think it's exactly the kind of national project that can pull us together at a time when we need more projects that are felt as a common, urgent thing we're all in on or part of in some way, in order for us to rebuild some of the social cohesion that this country needs.
That's an important point, and particularly at the moment where we see the response to COVID-19, because the lack of leadership from the White House and the administration really devolved down in many cases to the state level, but even often in states like Florida, as we just heard from Representative Murphy, down to the very local level, that there is a lack of feeling of common purpose and cohesion. And, of course, the media likes to focus on, understandably, the most sensational component of it, as does Twitter and social media, with the people who don't wear masks or who want to confront those who are requiring masks. How real do you think the division actually is versus the distorted vision that we get from staring too long at, our Twitter feed.
Well, if there's one thing I learned on the campaign, it's that Twitter is not the real world. It's part of the real world, and it definitely drives coverage because reporters are disproportionately likely to be on Twitter. But often there was a huge gulf between the social media-driven questions that I was asked by reporters and the questions I was asked by voters, and that was ultimately reflected in a lot of the results as well. That's not to say that these conversations we're seeing play out that way don't matter, but I think that if you look at where most Americans are, I mean, yeah, the crazy stuff is going to command the most attention. It always does. It's one of the issues we have with the president too, right? A lot of people are saying, well, why isn't Joe Biden getting more attention? When the sitting president of the United States makes an ass of himself, that will always get more attention than anybody behaving respectably. It's just going to happen. That's okay because there's quality as well as quantity to the kind of attention that we want to capture. And especially because I think now another reason we're seeing some people who had been with this president to date finally drifting away from him is it's just exhausting. Just as it's exhausting to be punched in the face by the flare up of the moment on social media. So what we need to do, I think, is make sure that we're never losing track of where the center of gravity of the American people is. And the good news is the center of gravity is shifting in a strongly progressive direction. But that is something that won't just happen on its own. The map will not save us. Demography is not destiny. We need to work to organize and to solve problems because you also get a lot of credit when you have a policy that actually works. Look at healthcare. Healthcare was the toxic, fatal liability to Democrats back in 2010, my first experience on the ballot. By 2018, it was the winning issue for Democrats. Why? Because the policy came out and people noticed that it helped them. And sometimes that's simple. I think, again, that's part of what's driving the results in Oklahoma and Kansas. There was a rejection of an ideologically extreme experiment of slashing taxes and services because it just didn't work. And while we got a lot of work to do in terms of narrative to connect the dots and to combat misinformation, in the end, people are, I think, more savvy than they get credit for when it comes to wanting to sustain and develop policies that are making their everyday lives better.
When you talk about that, this fits within the lagging indicator that Congress and the media is in general. And as you were on the campaign trail and as you interacted with your constituents in South Bend, particularly around climate, were there actions, whether it was at the local level or particularly things they thought the federal government could do that they talked about, that voters gravitated towards, that we just don't hear about, whether it's on Twitter or from the media?
Well, we built here in South Bend a climate action plan with a view toward that future that we needed. And the issue became a lot more personal around here because we had two once in a lifetime, once in a millennium floods. We had two of them, and they were 2 years apart. And we know there's more where that came from. And it's a reminder that you don't have to be on the coast to have to worry about these issues. From a policy standpoint, it always works best when people can see it, right? So even something as simple as popping a couple of city-funded electric car charging ports downtown just signaled that we were a community that was moving in that direction. And I think in a very tactical sense, made people a little more open to getting one of those vehicles that are not all, it's great if you can afford a Tesla, but, Chastity and I got a used Ford C-Max plug-in hybrid that's fantastic. And for the first 20 miles or so, which is as far as either one of us goes most days, might as well be an electric car. And you bet we plug it in downtown when we're close to that free charger the city put in, and there's more where that came from, right? So it's those little things that do a little bit of signaling, but also involve the resident, the citizen, in the kind of practicality of moving forward, as well as the big things like having a community conversation about what commitments we've got to make and what short-term costs we should be prepared to bear in order to make sure that the way that this city is built, the way it develops, the way we pick up trash, the way we move around is going to be consistent with a future where we are carbon neutral by 2050, which is what we're going to have to do really in order to make it. It's the same thing nationally. If people can physically feel like they can touch the consequences of these policy changes, it gets a lot easier, and it gets a lot of its kind of own momentum. When the windmills went from being some kind of newfangled exotic seeming thing to literally a part of our landscape and a source of jobs for people we know, that changed the way so many people in the heartland think about renewable energy. And despite a president talking about them causing cancer, or knocking out birds, or whatever it is, the reality is, again, something you can physically see. So it's a lot harder to trick people about it.
Yeah, and the fact that they're making money off of it and they know that that's where their electricity is coming from certainly does not hurt at all.
Yeah.
It's interesting. A lot of those are the false divides between Democrats and Republicans, or between voters and action on climate. Um, in previous years, we did see a lot of real disagreement within the Democratic Party, whether it was around should nuclear be part of the climate solution or not. Is there a role for carbon capture, either with natural gas for electricity or for industry? Whether you look at the select committee plan, or we look at where everyone from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Vice President Biden have moved, a lot of those conflicts seem to be dissipating. Is that your sense as well? And how much of it is a consensus or agreement around the urgency of action that will continue on after the election, particularly if Democrats win, versus a fleeting moment of unity because of the opponent that we have?
Here's the way I think of it. During the primary process in particular, it was a good time to debate how we were going to do these things. Things like face climate change and address the issue. And if all goes well in the election, we maintain our House majority, we get a good Senate, and we retake the White House, I think we'll be returning to those debates over exactly how to proceed. But in between arguing over how in the primary and weighing how in government is this general election. And this isn't about how, it's about whether. It is literally about whether we're going to face climate change or not. It's about whether climate change is real or not. Settling that question as a country is the order of the day. And I do think that that just submerges some of the other issues that are very real. What role nuclear ought to play. For my dime, it's going to be an important part of the transition, because for all the real problems with nuclear, the problem with carbon is right now bigger. But doesn't mean that we want to rely on it more than we have to. Same thing with a lot of these other issues that we're going to be negotiating. Of course, there are challenges in implementation. That's what we should be hashing out in government. But first, we got to get there. And so I am encouraged to see that there's a little more unity. I think not just because of what we're up against. It should be motivation enough, but you never want your central message just to be the other guy sucks. This is a time to really talk about the world we could live in. And then we'll get down to the business of exactly how to make sure we deliver it. And we'll make some mistakes along the way, and that's part of government.
Yeah, it's a very good segue to, we only have a couple more minutes, so I have two more questions. In terms of the world we live in, what is the case that you would make to voters, particularly younger voters, who are skeptical of Vice President Biden, who may not think that his climate agenda goes far enough, or because of his age or his experience in Washington, he's out of touch with the concerns and issues that they believe in?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, again, to remember that the role of the president is to set a direction, to broadly say, are we moving in this direction, or are we moving in that direction? When it comes to climate, it's literally, are we going to act on climate, or are we going to refuse to act on climate? I would also point out that in the vice president, we have somebody who has been out front on these issues in ways that, look, a radically progressive position in the 80s would look like a conservative position today. So we know that there are some evolution that we've all gone through as a country. But we got to remember that at the end of the day, the vice president's concerned with setting a tone that brings his country together, that moves us into the future, and that actually cares about what a future generation is going to be. Whereas the current president has literally said, I'm not worried about the future because I'm not going to be here. He's literally said that. So this is our opportunity to have leadership that will set the tone, that will then make it possible for us to be arguing over just how far we can go. But that means we actually have to be moving in this direction instead of that direction. That's the question that's being settled in November. And we need young people to be at the forefront of helping settle that question. The need for mobilization, the need for registration, the need for turnout, the need for us to make sure that nobody's on the sidelines has never been greater. Otherwise, all of this is academic. And we can't afford for this to just be a theoretical discussion about what other people should do. There's a very real live question about what we will do, and it's going more than at any other moment in a 4-year period. Your instance of greatest power is the instant you walk into that ballot box, or fill in that ballot from home, as we hope every American gets the opportunity safely to do by mail, and decide what the direction of this country is about to be.
So we've time for one last question, and I think you touched on very clearly to people: help others register to vote, make sure that they're registered themselves, that they vote, that they get out the vote, that they help others. The last 4 months alone have unfolded in a way that I don't think any of us could have predicted. We won't hold you to the answer to this last question, but as we're looking ahead to the next 4 months, what are you watching? What are you looking for that either we should be careful to see if it unfolds, or that leaves you a little more hopeful?
Yeah, so in terms of what to be careful for, look, I think there's a huge tailwind in terms of the realities, and there's a huge headwind in terms of the mechanics of the elections themselves. So from an electoral standpoint, that's what I'm worried about. Issue-wise, you're right, we're only halfway into this year. We're in the exact midway of the year. Think about what that means. That means the impeachment, the resolution of the Democratic nominating process, the pandemic, the response to the killing of George Floyd, the China and Russia scandal. All of that just happened in the first half of this year.
Iowa was this year.
Iowa was this year. Yeah. 4 months ago, I was running. We're just in a different world. And so we've been very bluntly reminded about how much can change in 4 months, which is how long we've got to go till the election. And by the way, these world-shaking historical events tend not to happen in ones and twos. So I would be ready for another major shock or two, possibly to include a national security event. If I were a hostile foreign power or a non-state actor, frankly, this summer would be a good time to try to throw the U.S. even further off balance. We should be ready for that. But what gives me hope is that the American people really are moving in the right direction, and we need the elections to reflect that. And there are things we can do about it. Yes, register, mobilize, persuade, vote, donate. Let me give you one more that's not being talked about enough. Consider being a poll worker. This, just for anyone my age or younger, is, I don't think, I can't even think of anyone I know my age who's done this, maybe a couple, which is interesting if you think about it. It's a basic civic duty. It's almost like jury duty. And the reason I'm mentioning this is, no matter how good we get at vote by mail, it's going to be very important to have safe in-person voting options, especially for communities of color and others who are more likely to be disfranchised if mail is your only option. And if you look at Milwaukee and how they went from 175 polling places last time to about 5, with terrible consequences for public health and for, again, especially Black and brown voters' opportunity to exercise their right. There's a lot of nefarious stuff out there. One of the main reasons driving this is just we didn't have poll workers. Yeah. There just aren't enough, because typically poll workers are retirees. And we're being reminded, again, in very blunt ways, that in this country, the most consequential democracy of the last 2,000 years on Earth, our elections, for better or worse, are run by, for the most part, by state authorities, county officials, and volunteers. Well, yeah, you actually get paid. It's like jury duty, not much. But my point is, that's something that if you're saying I'm worried about what's going to go down on election day, but I don't know how to help, I'm not a trained lawyer ready to join a sophisticated election protection hotline effort, what do I do? Consider being a poll worker. It could actually be the single best thing you could do to make sure there are more polling places able to handle votes. So that's the big thing I'm watching. Oh, one other thing. We're probably not going to know the results of the election on the night of. And having lived through Iowa, I can definitely relate to how frustrating that can be. But knowing that, especially if he loses, this president will probably try to challenge the legitimacy of the election, let's get ready now for the fact that that probably will happen. And it does not necessarily mean anything bad happen. It may simply be how long it takes to count the votes if we succeed in getting a lot of vote by mail done.
So that's extremely helpful, and it's a good reminder. It's a nonpartisan but patriotic and civic opportunity. Volunteer as a poll worker, and don't think of it as election day. Think of it maybe as the kickoff of election results week.
Very good.
And be patient. Well, that's a fantastic way to end. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a really important conversation. We hope you're able to join us again, maybe closer to the election, and we can
I
chat
hope
back
so.
how everything's proceeding. So we really
Sounds good.
appreciate it.
Same here. Thanks for the great work you're doing.
Excellent. Really appreciate it. And just for the audience, thank you also for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation.